Yeah, delighted to have Ben and Sydney with me. I'll introduce myself very quickly and then pass over. So I work for WSP based in the UK. I'm a technical director and I lead our nature advisory team. I've been working on biodiversity and natural capital for about 16 or 17 years and increasingly focusing on TNFD and nature positive. So I will hand over to Ben to do a quick intro and then Sydney.
Thank you, Jenny. Hi, everybody. My name is Ben O'Hickey. I'm a principal consultant in WSP's Nature Advisory team, so working with Jenny. My background is in natural capital and biodiversity net gain, and yeah, similar to Jenny, increasingly finding myself more and more in nature positive and the TNFD space, which is a very exciting place to be. I'll pass over to you, Sydney.
Thanks. Hello, everyone. Sydney Cheng here. I'm from WSP USA, Sustainability, Energy, and Climate Change team, based in San Francisco office. Have been since my work with WSP, I have been supporting many clients on their journey to align with TNFD, helping them support their ESG reporting and disclosure, and recently supporting some clients around their TNFD journey and also understanding their biodiversity risk opportunities. Now I'll pass back to Jenny.
Thank you both. So I'll just give a very quick run through the agenda then before we start. So we'll do a very brief overview of the TNFD. I'll just make sure everyone's kind of understanding where we're starting from in terms of this presentation. And then Ben and Sydney will focus on sharing with you some experiences from some of the early TNFD assessments that we've been doing with clients, looking at some challenges that are common across those areas of work and some of the innovations and solutions that we've been providing. So we'll then wrap up with some key takeaways and Q&A. So just very briefly then, just to set the scene before we go into lessons learned, hopefully you're all familiar with the TNFD itself, possibly piloted it as well already. So it's a risk management and disclosure framework so that organisations can understand, report on and importantly act on the nature-related risks and opportunities that they may be exposed to. It really is set out very similar to the TCFD, and its purpose is to look at shifting finance towards more nature positive outcomes and certainly away from outcomes that have negative implications for nature and nature loss. The reason that a lot of organisations are looking at adopting this is because every business interfaces with nature in some way, either directly or through its value chain. And it's an important component of risk management. So understanding what your exposure might be to nature loss, where that exists and what you might be able to do about it is critical to ensure business resilience going forward in the rapidly changing world that faces us. So there's a lot of critical mass around this and hence the reason for this snack and learn, and hopefully you will learn something to take away from this session. So the next slide just covers one of the core components of the TNFD, which is called the LEAP approach. LEAP stands for locate, evaluate, assess and prepare. This is not a mandatory part of the disclosures, but it is provided as a guide to help people collect the information and undertake the processes that are needed to disclose against the 14 key disclosures that the TNFD have set out. So it outlines how businesses can actually start to understand, to identify where those risks and opportunities might be, and to prioritise those in relation to how material they are for the business, to reflect on what the targets might be that are suitable and how those could be monitored and reported on going forward. So we're going to be talking quite a bit about the LEAP approach because that's a key component of what we've been working with some of our clients on in the past year or so. So that sort of sets the scene as to what we're going to talk about, and I'm going to hand over to Ben as the next person to speak, and he will run you through some of the lessons that we have been learning from some different pilots. So over to you, Ben.
Thanks a lot, Jenny. And yeah, as Jenny mentioned, I guess in the spirit of disclosing, we thought there'd be some real benefit in this presentation of talking through some real world examples. You know, TNFD is new for a lot of people, and the final guidance was only released in September. So if this is a new world to you, then I don't think you're alone in this by any stretch. And we wanted to talk about some of the real world examples that we've kind of come across over the last 12 months and explain some of the common challenges we're seeing and how we've helped clients and our kind of colleagues with these. We've been lucky enough with WSP through kind of our existing networks and our clients and people that we work with to have an opportunity to work on TNFD in a number of different sectors. Those have been some UK focused projects, things like working with a UK based airport, and some more international projects as well. So working with international steel manufacturers or global asset managers. And these projects have ranged over the last 12 months from initial pilot studies when TNFD was in its beta stage to helping clients with TNFD readiness assessments and sharing our knowledge with them around what's required as part of TNFD and reviewing whether their company is in a position that's ready to take on TNFD and report against it. And now that the guidance is out in September, we're getting the opportunity to run full TNFD assessments across a variety of different sectors. And that's been a really interesting process, and lots is learned every time we start a new one of these. And I think one thing that will come out of this talk, hopefully, is that TNFD is sector specific in some elements, and no two companies are the same, and therefore no two TNFD assessments are the same. So there's a real breadth and range of what we're seeing across our projects, and yeah, that's what makes it quite exciting, and that's where some of these interesting lessons have come from. So as mentioned, we thought it'd be really useful to talk through some of the common challenges. I think there's a real hesitation to approach TNFD, partly because it's where to start and the unknown nature around it. So we thought by talking through some of the common challenges that we've seen people facing and how we're suggesting they get around them, hopefully that will encourage people to engage with TNFD and will act as a bit of a catalyst to starting some more projects. So some of these challenges, and I kind of touched on that, is deciding where to start. TNFD can be applied to a whole company and should be eventually. However, it doesn't need to start that way. And as a company, as an organization, understanding where you want to start with your TNFD assessment can be very tricky and can often be the major hurdle in terms of starting these. And once you've made that decision, it can be a lot easier to keep the ball rolling and continue with that development. So we'll talk a bit about how different companies have decided to approach where to start and where they are now with their TNFD assessment. Data availability, this being a new assessment that requires new data, but actually what we're seeing is that a lot of this data is being captured elsewhere. So we want to talk a bit about the data gaps that people initially have and how we're helping solve those and the lessons that we've learned in that area. I think the internal expertise and understanding who you need to consult with around your TNFD assessments is a real question that people have at the start, whether it's managed by ESG teams or sustainability reporting teams, or whether it should be delivered elsewhere within a business. So we'll talk about the different groups and teams that we've seen clients assemble and how that's helped them with their TNFD assessments. And then finally, we'll talk about the value chain. This can be the biggest impact for quite a few companies, and particularly a company like WSP and ourselves offering services to our clients. Our largest impact is most likely in our value chain. So we'll talk a bit about companies that we've worked with that have approached their value chain and how they've done it, and if that's something that you're interested in, a couple of approaches in terms of prioritizing that and understanding where to start. And hopefully going through these challenges will kind of debunk some of the myths around them, and as a result kind of pave the way for more people to undertake TNFD assessments. So as mentioned, one of the key challenges a lot of people seem to face is understanding where to start on their TNFD assessment. I think this is for a number of reasons. There's obviously a desire to assess the whole company as soon as possible, but that often is a much bigger challenge than just taking on it one piece of it at a time and trying to understand your impacts on nature in an incremental fashion and ratcheting up your assessment. So the question within TNFD is actually says kind of the idea is understanding what are the organizational activities where there's likely to be a material nature-related dependency, impacts, risks and opportunities. And quite a lot of people seem to have a fairly good idea for their company what that means pretty much straight away. And so what we're seeing is that companies quite often have a good idea of where to start. This can either be due to the availability of data, so knowing that we could run a TNFD assessment on this part of our business because they capture the right amount of data. It would allow us to go through the assessment in one go, and then we can use that process to scale it up across the business. Others are doing the opposite and saying that we know that this business sector is the area that's likely to have the biggest impact on nature, and therefore as a result we want to focus on that first, because by tackling that we can then start reporting on our biggest impacts. For some, it's the supply and value chain, as mentioned, for kind of supporting and service organizations. That's definitely the first place to start. What we're understanding is that the entry point for TNFD will vary for each organization, and I think there's a real question to be asked around what is your reason for doing TNFD, and that will often then guide where to start. And what we would suggest is that if you have areas of the company where you think you collect this data and you want to trial a TNFD assessment to see how it runs and then scale that up to your whole company, potentially a site level or an asset level assessment is a really good place to start, and then that can be scaled up across business sectors. Or equally, if you're an organization where you know that you have major impacts within one of your business sectors, maybe it's best to tackle that sector first to try and understand those major impacts as soon as possible, and then you can branch out your TNFD assessment to a more broader range once you have an understanding of the process and it's something that you've seen. But yeah, really, I think we'd refer back to that question of why are you as a company undertaking your TNFD assessment, and that really should guide where you can start and where it will take you. So that second point we had was around data availability. As is often the way when we start assessments, there's questions around what data needs to be considered, where can this data be found? And TNFD is no different in that sense. I think we're finding that particularly in TNFD, it's asking organizations that don't normally have to deal in spatial data to start understanding spatial data, particularly around what assets do you have and where are they? The first question in TNFD is around trying to understand what assets your business has or what business sectors are most likely to interact with nature. And obviously understanding where those assets are or those business sectors operate is a really key question to that. So within companies, there's now a requirement for them to understand exactly where all their assets are, where land ownerships are, where land rental is. And so having an understanding as a company of that already is a really good first step to understanding your TNFD requirements. But equally, if you're trying to understand what to do first in your TNFD assessment, knowing what you've got and where is a really important place to start. And that's really fundamental to that locate phase, which is the first part of the leap, which Jenny mentioned earlier. So having that GIS capability or understanding that you're going to need some support with GIS is a really important element. Second is the environmental status or environmental spatial information that now is needed in order to inform your TNFD assessment. This is something quite a lot of companies aren't necessarily used to working with, or at least teams that are delivering TNFD necessarily aren't necessarily using those data sets day to day. Luckily, they're really easily available and easy to find. The TNFD guidance has a lot of information on this, and there are tools such as IBAT, which is free to use for non-commercial use, biodiversity screening tool, which contains large amounts of data around biodiversity intactness, ecosystem risk, and other elements which are really important in terms of undertaking that initial locate phase. So although it can be quite daunting at first, there's a lot of very good tools, and the TNFD and also Encore has a lot of very good resources around what can be used in order to carry out that environmental screening that's needed at the start of the TNFD process. The other element of TNFD that again can cause a few challenges is around the capturing of non-spatial data. So as part of locate, there's a real need to understand where assets are and what are they, but equally there's a real need to know about what you do and where. And I think particularly for TNFD assessments which are focusing on business sectors and business organizations, there's a real need to gather supply chain and procurement information. We'll talk about that a bit later in the value chain question, but again, there's a real opportunity to take advantage of the information that you're gathering elsewhere, whether that's within your internal governance system, so your governance and management elements, or that are part of your EMS, or within existing ESG dashboards or corporate risk management. But understanding that as part of a TNFD assessment, you're going to need to delve into these other data sources is a really useful place to be before the assessment starts in earnest. And obviously, as this is new, innovation is a really key part of this sector. So one of the things that we're kind of looking to do at WSP is develop our internal tool, Nature Vista. And this really is the idea of bringing together those last two slides that I spoke about. So bringing those environmental spatial data sets that were mentioned, including things like IBAT and the Encore natural capital screening tools, but then also allowing companies to input their own business sector or supply chain information within that. And the idea really is that it kind of bridges that gap between local and global data sets. And this is currently in development. We're working with a number of clients to try and further and refine this, but there's a lot of innovation going on in this sector. The TNFD provides a whole list of resources around data availability and tools to gather more data for companies. So I'd recommend you reviewing those or kind of looking within your own systems in terms of trying to understand what data there is and how you can use that for your TNFD. Away from data into people, I think one of the things we're seeing is that who does the TNFD assessment internally with an organization, or who needs to help the TNFD assessment, is a really tricky question for some organizations, and one that some people struggle with initially. I think TNFD needs to be held by a central team, and that team needs to rely on a number of different people, whether that's ESG managers, or for instance, when we were working with the UK-based airport, there was a real focus on assets and site managers, and therefore the TNFD team that was pulled together to work on that project had a large component of the environmental and site managers, and they were instrumental in terms of talking about the operations of those sites, how those works were carried out day to day, and the existing efforts and processes that were put in place to try and manage nature and reduce the impacts on it. For other companies, such as the international steel manufacturer, there was a much bigger focus on supply chain and business operations due to the nature of their process and what they do for work. There was much more focus on their supply chain and their resources, and therefore a completely different part of the business was needed to inform that TNFD assessment. And that really focused around business operations, procurement, and other elements of their business. Finally, for some other projects, we're seeing other combinations of teams that are needed. For organizations that are looking at particularly business operations and business sectors, there's a real need for governance and getting input from directors and non-executive directors and people responsible for making these decisions. Or equally, there's a need for technical specialists if it is, an organization that has a very niche role or has a specific impact on nature. So what we're seeing is that for companies that are starting TNFD assessments or looking for support, understanding your own business, what you're going to look at in your TNFD, and who needs to be consulted internally is a really useful part of that and a key step. And finally, value chain. So as mentioned, for some companies, their impacts on nature are very much within their direct operations, and that's where they should focus, and site managers and business and direct operations is kind of the key sector. For others, it's very much the value chain, whether that's upstream, supply chain, or downstream. And a lot of companies are interested in looking at their value chain, but don't necessarily know where to start. So one of the things that we really recommend is taking a deeper, narrower approach to this. And by that, we mean identifying and prioritizing those elements of the value chain that are likely to have the largest impacts on nature, focusing on those to start off with, understanding those impacts and dependencies, and then expanding that out further across the business in multiple iterations of the TNFD. Some really useful tools are available for that, and on the right here is an example of the SB, so the Science-Based Targets for Nature tools and guidance around the classification of commodities and identifying high impact commodities within a business. And again, these are very easy tools that can be looked at and used to screen or scope the focus of a TNFD assessment, so it can then be refined in the future. And I think the final point on value chain, and again, we've touched on this before, is that what we have found with a number of our different companies that we've worked with and with our clients is that a lot of this data is being collected elsewhere, whether or not it's in exactly the right form that's needed for a TNFD, or whether or not the TNFD team knows it's being collected in the first place. Going back to my point about who do you involve in this, a lot of this data is being collected and being reviewed, whether that's part of social value reviews of companies, kind of wider sustainability reporting, but also within specifically things like TCFD. A lot of this data is being collected previously, and actually by looking at the overlaps and by looking at how we can try and maximize the efficiencies between all of these different ESG reporting requirements on companies, there's a lot of benefit to do some really good stuff very quickly. And so on that, I think I'm going to pass over to Sydney, who's going to talk a bit about what we've done in terms of TCFD previously, and then how that's now linking to our TNFD work. Sorry for all the acronyms. Sydney, over to you.
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, so if we can move to the next slide for, like Ben mentioned, and also Jenny mentioned earlier, TNFD and TCFD has a lot of similarities. As you can see here, the four main recommendation pillar: governance, strategy, risk management, metrics and target. TCFD and TNFD are closely aligned. It is because TNFD takes the inspiration and approach from the TCFD. Both initiatives are voluntary, market-led initiatives focused on developing a set of practical recommendation and guidance for market participants to use on a voluntary basis. But we see more and more trend right now, like incorporating TCFD and TNFD into the regulatory conversation as well. But both framework, it is the goal. The goal is to use the tool of risk management and disclosure to guide the capital flows to more sustainable outcomes. With that being said, WSP has proposed our own TNFD approach. Then we can move on to the next slide. That is discover, assess, plan, and transform. We have our extensive experience engaging with our clients since 2016 on clients' TCFD journey. And for TNFD, it is very similar. That is discover, assess, plan, and transform. Discover, really understand what are the current gaps, where companies are, and where the peer are doing in terms of nature and TNFD. Assess, like what Ben and Jenny mentioned earlier, around assessing the impact and dependency, understanding risk and opportunity facing your business. Plan, strategic planning, thinking about how you can change your business model, some of your ESG governance strategy, changing to incorporate nature and to mainstream nature into your day-to-day operation. Lastly, is transform. Transform your business in a way that is aligned with the ambitions and the goal that's set up by the international community on the nature conservation. That is the general approach for discover and assess and plan and transform. As you understand, for aligning with TNFD, it is not a one-time stop, one-time effort. It requires several years of effort, and it is a continuous process. It is a rocket approach that requires continuous effort and also gradual process and progress to align with the TNFD. As we mentioned earlier, TCFD and TNFD share a lot of similar recommendations, but there are indeed unique recommendations from TNFD, such as describe the organization's human rights policy and also engagement with the local community on the nature-related issue. That brings to our unique WSP solution that with our global expert, how can we better support on your journey to align with the TNFD? As Ben mentioned, to start small and to conduct asset level and direct operation assessment to understand what are the impact and dependency at the site level. In the same time, it is also a really good start to do a gap analysis and also a TNFD roadmap. As we mentioned earlier, TCFD data such as where are your direct operation, where are your own sites, where are your leased offices, those site level information are critical to understand. So you are not normally if you have a ESG governance system in place, if you have set any other target, you have solid foundation. So having a gap analysis, understanding where you are and also how you can improve on your base on your foundation of the ESG governance and strategy and management process, that's always a good start for you to start your TNFD journey. On the next slide, this is a quick screenshot of our TNFD gap analysis tool. You can get a taste of it once you going through this proprietary WSP TNFD gap analysis tool. You should be able to tell from your governance, strategy, risk management, metrics, and target where you are and how closely you are aligned to those this 14 recommendation. Once you are ready, better understand where are your gaps. Oftentimes, we can see in the assess phase that companies are need a little bit support to understand your nature, dependency, and the impact. So for the next slide, we will be talking a little bit about the assess process. Like Jenny and Ben mentioned, the LEAP approach, locate, evaluate, assess, and prepare. It is oftentimes the heavy lifting part of the TNFD process. This is also unique in the TNFD framework to discuss about the dependency and impact, risk and opportunity for nature. This requires LEAP assessment. Like Jenny mentioned, this is not mandatory, but it's a recommended guidance for companies to follow to really understand your interface with nature, whether you are operating in biodiversity sensitive area, what are the biodiversity integrity status, ecosystem status at your site level. Once you have that information in mind, it is also really useful to leverage that information to fit into the materiality assessment. I know double materiality and also materiality assessment are on top of many of your head, and also some of the regulatory driver nowadays. So having that assessment down, that can really inform this process to use as an input for that assessment. In the next slide, we can talk to you a little bit about the LEAP tool. Here's a screenshot of our LEAP assessment tool. You can see what type of information is being captured in this tool, and how this tool can help you facilitate the LEAP assessment and also biodiversity risk assessment. In the next slide, once we have a better understanding, what are your risks and opportunity, what are your impact and dependency, it's time to plan. One of the recommendations from TNFD is to describe your resilience of your strategy and to nature-related risk opportunity, taking into consideration of different scenarios. That's where the scenario analysis comes in. This is also a fast evolving space for both climate and nature to understand what are the different forward-looking scenarios and what are the risk opportunity under different scenarios, and then how business can better prepare and also increase the resilience of it. With all the strategic planning being done using the tool of like scenario analysis, company oftentimes wants to report and disclose, following the TNFD guidance or some other ESG rating and rater agencies such as CDP, S&P Global, DJSI, GRASB, GRI, and SASB. Following the TNFD recommendation can really help you lay a foundation for disclosure and reporting, and also responding to your ESG raters and rankers request on the TNFD and also biodiversity related information. As the rest of the framework, CDP, DJSI, GRI, and SASB are closely aligned with TNFD. In the next slide, we have our TNFD reporting tool. We understand normally companies have some level of information, so having this TNFD reporting tool can help you capture all the sources of information into one place, whether they are you disclosing the CDP response or sustainability report or ESG report or your practice statement. You have one central place, a central reference point to capture all the information around TNFD using the TNFD reporting tool. Last but not least, our transform phase. If we can move to the next slide, many of the companies who started this journey have a really ambitious goal to set a target around nature. So we know we have some of our clients interested in setting a science-based target for nature. We have also clients really on the front end integrating nature and also climate together as part of their transition planning, understanding how you can use nature-based solution or having nature consideration into climate transition plan. That's also one of our ongoing efforts to support clients to understand the climate-nature nexus. In the next slide, we can talk through some of the options that if you are a company that have a long-term goal and ambitions to really conserve and hold the biodiversity loss. For the UK business, you can consider signing up for the Nature Positive Business Pledge. For some other international business, Science-Based Target Network will develop a series of targets around land, biodiversity, water, and forest. It's also a good consideration for you to keep in mind. With that being said, I'm going to pass down to Jenny for some key takeaway.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Sydney. Really great to hear your thoughts and based on your experiences over the last few months. So I know we're sort of running quite close to time, so just very quickly, just 3 key takeaways from those points is obviously building on existing work and making the most of efforts you've already done in the business to collect information for ESG reporting or for compliance and so on. Absolutely everybody will have somewhere to start and no one will start from scratch entirely. Leadership buy-in is something perhaps we didn't really talk about too much, but is really important in terms of the why. So as I said on my first slide, you know, every business will have some interface with nature, and so it's important to understand what that is and what you can do about it. And so presenting that through the process of providing some resource to look at the TNFD or to explore your interface with nature and biodiversity will help you to demonstrate the importance of investing resource in it as a business going forward. And then sort of the third key takeaway is just start with what your gaps are. So, you know, understand what you've got already, get that buy-in, identify your gaps, and then see what sort of teams you need to put together to fill in those gaps and be able to do an initial assessment against the TNFD. So I think on that note, we will move to the final slide, I think, which just has our contact details, of course, if you'd like to get in touch. We've got about 10 minutes now if there are any questions, so please do pop them in the questions chat. If you have anything, they will come through to us. And Ben and Sydney, if you want to come back on screen, I will just try and moderate some questions for you. So let's kick off with first one quite quickly. Is TNFD compulsory for any companies yet? Who would like to tackle that one? Sydney?
Yeah, sure. So like we mentioned earlier, TNFD is a voluntary framework, like similar to TCFD, it's also a voluntary framework. But more and more we see regulatory movement that is incorporating framework like TCFD and TNFD into the regulatory conversation. So there's the possibility that TNFD will become like part of the regulatory driver as mandatory, but the framework itself is voluntary. It is voluntary for company to follow. Yeah.
Thank you, Sydney. And then another quick one that's come in is how long does it take to do a TNFD assessment? So Ben, just on those examples you've given, what would you sort of say?
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. It obviously varies in terms of the scale at which it's being undertaken, whether it's just a site or a kind of a single part of an organization or the whole company itself. I think what we're tend to seeing is it's around 4 to 5 months, I'd say, to do a whole LEAP approach for an organization, and that there's obviously a lot of variables in that, but yeah, I think around a month to carry out each stage of LEAP, and bringing that all together to around 5 months as a first go at TNFD is about standard. But obviously for large organizations with lots of impacts on nature, that will take longer, or companies that are just looking to run a pilot TNFD assessment, that's much shorter. And the other thing I think is worth mentioning is that the TNFD readiness assessments that we've been doing can be done very quickly, and those are kind of a couple of weeks as opposed to months, and that's often quite a useful place to start.
So that's the gap analysis, that sort of first.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. So this one here says, would you recommend companies do a double materiality assessment first to help identify where biodiversity might be relevant, and where to start with TNFD, or do TNFD first to provide input into a double materiality assessment.
Yeah, happy to take on this one.
Sydney, yeah.
But feel free to chime in as well. I think this is very great question, very timely conversation as well. Some of our clients are really struggling with like the timing of it. But as you understand, biodiversity is just one topic of the double materiality assessment. There are many other topics like climate, wastewater. They're all part of the CSRD requirement of the double materiality. But oftentimes, it is logical to do a biodiversity leap assessment to use that as an input for double materiality. But in practice, in reality, we understand some of the process happens in parallel. Like you do a biodiversity risk assessment in the same time doing double materiality. As we understand, some of our clients facing a short amount of time to get everything in place for the double materiality process. So those two things can also happen in parallel to feed as input to one another. But it is reasonable. It also makes sense to do a biodiversity risk assessment first and to use that as input for the double materiality assessment. Otherwise, for the double materiality assessment, it will mainly relying on your internal expert view and also external expert, like in a qualitative way. And that might lack of specificity and also the depth of the research. So in the face of having the assurance and also verification for the double materiality process, I think it is best to do this biodiversity risk assessment first.
Thanks, Sydney. Got lots of questions coming in now. So Ben, how can TNFD be used to encourage a shift to more green or nature-based and integrated green-grey solutions? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. TNFD is obviously at a much aimed to be implemented at a much larger scale, a higher scale than most blue-green solutions, I would say. I think the one thing it does do is it does bring that transparency, and it does ask questions of companies that aren't using blue-green infrastructure, why they're missing out on those opportunities. And I think that's kind of the point of TNFD. It doesn't cause the actions itself, but it does report on people that are taking inaction or missing out on taking the steps. And then it is up to shareholders and it's up to kind of company governance to put that pressure on. So TNFD in itself wouldn't necessarily cause the implementation of blue-green solutions, but what it would do is kind of show that opportunity is being missed. And then when it does start happening, it would allow people to capture that impact as well. So yeah, slowly through time, I think would be the kind of response to that.
Yeah, I think also from all the sessions I've sort of sat on that the TNFD have led themselves, there is always that focus on opportunities. Like they're always talking about risks and opportunities, and there is scope within those disclosures and the metrics particularly that are recommended to demonstrate if you are doing positive things and to be able to kind of measure that and show that as well. So I think that is a neat way of, as you say, sort of disclosing without sort of making people do it. It sort of allows you, if you are doing a lot of really positive nature-based solutions, to put that forward in the same framework.
Yeah, absolutely. And what we want is everybody doing TNFD assessments, and then people can see what their competitors are doing, and then the pressure comes on for them to do something similar. So hopefully when this is more widely adopted, it will have a much wider impact.
Yeah. Okay, there's about 3 questions here which are relating to WSP ourselves, actually. So I'm guessing there's quite a few WSP colleagues on this call. So one is about elaborating on our experience serving international clients, especially in the finance investment sector, and what our global expertise is on this. I mean, I can kind of very briefly tackle that. So we have people certainly in Canada, the US, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, and the Nordics, who are very much sort of at the forefront of this with our clients and working with clients in their own regions, but also globally. And we collaborate, so, you know, working on developing tools and things with Sydney, working on projects with WSP Canada, you know, WSP UK. So we have a breadth of experience, and yeah, if anyone wants to kind of tap in to that, please do drop any of us a message by email and we can link you in. And then another question there sort of around what we're doing ourselves. So I'm going to direct this to you, Ben, because of the nature positive work you're doing. It says, are we as a company planning to publish a TNFD report in near time, even though it's a voluntary requirement?
Thanks, Jenny. So I think on that question, we just need to differentiate between WSP UK and WSP Global. So WSP UK last year, through the work of Tom Butterworth and Margot Green, and signed up to that UK BBF biodiversity, the nature positive commitment that Sydney mentioned in his slide. So WSP were one of the founding members of that. We signed up to it, and as part of that, there is a requirement to publish a biodiversity materiality report this year. So WSP UK signed up to that, and myself, Tom and Margot have been working on that this year, and the hope is that it will be published, well, as part of our commitment, we will publish it ahead of February 2024. So that isn't TNFD, that's separate, that's part of that UK BBF commitment, but that is work that WSP UK has committed to. Globally, the picture's slightly different, and that's obviously run by WSP Global. This year, a materiality assessment was undertaken, which is similar to TNFD, but wasn't fully aligned with TNFD. I don't think there is a decision that has been made yet about what will be done next year. TNFD is being discussed, but that would probably come from a global level. And what that would definitely do is take advantage of the work that's been done this year for the global materiality assessment, but also for the UK biodiversity materiality assessment as well. So there isn't a firm commitment on that either way, but we're definitely shifting towards that as a company.
Yep. Thank you, Ben. Let's have a look, possibly time for one last question. So what shall I go for? Could you explain a little bit about the relationship between the TNFD and the Science-Based Targets Network? Maybe, and again, maybe because you've looked into it, how much connection is there between those two?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's more and more into linking commitments now. So, and I think Sydney touched on this in his slides as well. So TNFD is about disclosing risks, opportunity, impacts, and dependencies. The science-based targets is about transforming or setting commitments as a company towards the science-based recommendations around impacts on nature and biodiversity. So they are interrelated in the sense that quite often towards the end of the TNFD assessment, companies are using the SBTN's science-based targets for nature to set their targets and to carry out the end of the TNFD assessment, but they are two separate guidances. I think the other thing that's just worth mentioning is the timelines for development. So as we touched on at the start, TNFD was being piloted at the start of this year and by some very early adopters a year ago now, and was fully released in September this year. SBTN has been released in part, but isn't being fully released. And because those science-based targets around nature obviously require a lot of scientific research and kind of backing, they probably won't get released in the short term, and it will be a much longer, more gradual process of releasing those targets. And they seem to be being released at according to certain sectors at certain times. So you can definitely carry out your TNFD assessment at this stage without using the SBTN, but that's a resource that I think all organizations will be using more and more and more as they get further developed. And there's already some really useful tools around identifying high materiality within value chains, as we showed on the slides, or guidance around setting targets for certain sectors that we'd really recommend companies using, and we're kind of using those with our clients at the moment.
Yeah, also to add to the Ben's point around interconnectedness for those two, SBTN and also TNFD, those two framework and also our organization are in close collaboration. One of the examples that we can see here is the LEAP approach from TNFD is closely aligned with the SBTN target methodology. So those two are closely aligned and map to each other. But there's also one difference is for TNFD, we wish to develop a sector specific guidance down the line. But right now, SBTN is agnostic. It applies to all the sector. It doesn't differentiate sector to sector. So there are commonality. There are also some differences.
Yeah, thank you. On the website for SBTN, there is a timeline actually that you can see, which shows sort of roughly when they're planning to release certain elements, and the biodiversity one, I believe, is sort of towards the latter end of 2024. Okay, I think we'll leave it there as we're sort of a couple of minutes over time. So thank you, Ben and Sydney. Really great to kind of hear your thoughts on today's webinar, and thank you to everyone for listening. And if you've got any questions or any feedback, then please do get in touch, and have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.